I was 21 years old when I understood that loving someone outside the boundaries of everything you have ever known is not a choice that arrives dramatically, not a decision made in a single moment of reckless feeling, but something that assembles itself quietly over time from the specific materials of genuine attention and honest conversation, and the particular accumulation of being known by someone who had no prior understanding of who you were supposed to be, and therefore knew only who you actually were. I understood this not as a philosophical observation, but as the lived experience of a woman who had spent her entire life being looked at, and had finally, in the company of one specific person, been seen, and who understood the difference between those two things in the specific way that you understand a difference only when you have experienced both sides of it completely. The looking had been present since I was 16 years old, in the specific form that looking takes in a closed community of 53 families in Licking County, Ohio, where the absence of mirrors and cosmetics and the entire apparatus of external enhancement that the English world uses to manufacture beauty meant that the beauty that existed without those things was more visible rather than less, more unignorable rather than more ignorable. A fact that the community system for suppressing individual distinction had not accounted for, and that I had been living inside the failure of that accounting for 5 years by the time I met the person who changed everything. His name was Andrew Calloway. He was 26 years old, an environmental scientist from Columbus, who had been contracted by the county to assess the watershed quality of the creek systems running through and adjacent to several farms in our settlement, work that required him to be on the settlement's land with permission but without supervision, moving through the fields and the creek banks with his equipment and his notebooks in the specific absorbed way of someone who is primarily interested in what the land is doing, rather than in the people managing it, which made him, from the first morning I encountered him at the eastern fence line of our property, where the creek ran closest to the road, different in a way that I noticed before I had decided whether to notice it. He looked up from his equipment when he became aware of me standing at the fence line, and he said, without the particular adjustment of manner that English people in our area frequently made when they encountered Amish women, without the studied casualness or the deliberate over-normalizing or the subtle performance of someone deciding how to behave simply directly and without management. I am sorry to be on your land without introduction. My name is Andrew Calloway. I am assessing the watershed. He said it as if I was a person he was speaking to rather than a category he was navigating, and the simplicity of it was the first thing. My name is Miriam. I was born and raised in an old-order Amish settlement in Licking County, Ohio, the eldest daughter of David and Lydia Schrock, in a community where my face had been a subject of communal management since I was old enough to understand that the way rooms changed when I entered them was not something that happened to everyone and was something the community considered a problem requiring management rather than a quality requiring acknowledgement. I am 25 years old now. I have been out of the community for 3 years, and I am telling this story because what I lost when I loved Andrew Calloway was real and counted, and I will not pretend otherwise. And because what I found in the loving was also real and also counted, and I will not pretend otherwise about that either. And because the full truth of both things existing simultaneously is the only honest way to tell a story that contains both. This is not a story about beauty as advantage. It is a story about beauty as complication, about what it means to exist inside a system that has no honest language for what you are, and therefore has no honest protection for what you are, and therefore cannot protect you from the specific consequences of being what you are when those consequences arrive. I had been the most beautiful woman in my community since I was 16 years old in the assessment of everyone except me, because I had not been given the mirrors or the language to make that assessment about myself and had known it only through the world's response to it, through the management and the monitoring and the particular exhaustion of being a problem the community was solving continuously without naming the problem directly. Andrew Calloway was the first person who looked at my face and did not manage it. He looked at it the way he looked at the watershed, with the specific focused interest of someone finding something real and wanting to understand it. The difference was everything. Before we go any further, if something in these words is sitting in a real place inside you, leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from, or tell me if you have ever loved someone that your world told you was the wrong person to love. I read every single comment. Every one. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, please hit that like button right now. It helps more people find this channel, and it tells me you are ready for the truth. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. The watershed assessment required Andrew to be on or adjacent to our land for 3 weeks, and over those 3 weeks, our encounters at the eastern fence line developed from introductions to exchanges to, in the second week, conversations that exceeded what the occasion officially required while always remaining, in their visible form, within what could be described as the practical business of a landowner's family member and an English contractor discussing matters relevant to the work being done on the property. I was not naive about the describing. I had grown up inside a community that monitored the behavior of its women with the specific vigilance of people who understand that the monitored behavior and its described form are not always identical and who are specifically watching for the gap between them. I maintained the gap carefully. I maintained it because the conversations were real, and I was not willing to lose them to the community's management before I understood what they were. What they were, I understood by the end of the second week, was the experience of being spoken to as a person by someone who had come to that speaking without any prior understanding of what kind of person I was supposed to be, which meant that what he found when he spoke to me was the actual person rather than the category the community had spent years organizing its responses around. He asked me questions about the land with genuine interest, and I answered with the knowledge of someone who has farmed the same land for 21 years and has been paying the kind of attention that produces real knowledge. He said, after I had described the creek's behavior in the wet years versus the dry years with the specific observational detail I had been accumulating without knowing I was accumulating it, you have been watching this watershed your whole life. I said, I have been watching everything. There is not much else to do in this valley. He said, most people watch without seeing. You see? He said it as a statement of fact rather than a compliment, with the specific quality of someone observing rather than flattering, and I received it as what it was, which was the most accurate description of myself that anyone had offered me in 21 years. The feelings I am describing did not announce themselves as romantic in the beginning. They announced themselves as the specific relief of being seen accurately, which I had not known I was carrying the absence of until the absence was addressed. It was only when the 3 weeks of the assessment were almost finished, and I understood that Andrew Calloway was going to return to Columbus and take the accurate seeing with him, that the feeling clarified itself into something I could not pretend was simply the relief of good conversation. I understood this, and I held it in the specific private place where I kept things I did not have sanctioned language for, and I did not know what to do with the holding. He left on a Friday. On the Thursday before he left, he said, at the fence line, in the final minutes of the final afternoon, I want to ask you something that is not about the watershed. I said, you can ask. He said, would you want to continue talking after the assessment is finished? He said, I understand if that is not possible. I understand what that would require. I am not asking you to decide now. I am asking if you would want to, if the wanting matters to your decision. I said, why does the wanting matter if the wanting cannot change the possible? He said, because knowing what you want is always worth knowing, regardless of what you can do with it. He said, and because sometimes the wanting finds a way that the deciding before the wanting cannot find. I stood at the fence line with the creek running behind him and the particular quality of a Thursday afternoon in June in Licking County that makes the world look like it has been lit specifically, and I said, I would want to. He said, then I will leave you a way to reach me if you decide to. He placed a folded piece of paper on the fence post. He picked up his equipment. He walked to his truck. I took the paper from the fence post and put it in my pocket, and I stood at the fence line for a long time after his truck was gone from the road. In the Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 4, it is written, He has taken me to the banquet hall, and his banner over me is love. I had read that verse in the German of our community Bible since I was old enough to read and had understood it as a verse about the specific completeness of being claimed by love, of existing under love's banner in the way that soldiers exist under a flag, as a declaration of belonging. I stood at the eastern fence line of our property with a folded piece of paper in my pocket, and I thought about banners and about belonging and about the specific difference between the belonging that the community offered, which was real and which I had lived inside for 21 years, and the belonging that the fence line conversation had produced in me, which was different in the specific way that being claimed for what you actually are is different from being claimed for the category you occupy. And I understood that the difference was not small and was not something I could unfeel by deciding not to feel it. I held the paper for 6 weeks. I did not contact him during the 6 weeks. I went through the ordinary requirements of those 6 weeks. The domestic work and the community gatherings and the Sunday services and the particular managed social life of a woman who is known primarily for a face she did not choose and who has learned to move through the settlement in the careful way that minimizes the friction her presence produces. And I did all of this while carrying the paper in the lining of my everyday dress and the feeling it represented in the specific interior place where I kept things the community did not have room for. At the end of 6 weeks, the carrying was heavier than the holding was sustainable, and I contacted him from the English phone at the farm supply store 2 miles from the settlement. He answered. He said, "Miriam." He said my name the way he had said it at the fence line, as if it belonged to a specific person rather than a general category. I said, "I called." He said, "I know." He said, "I am glad." We talked for 40 minutes in the way that people talk when they have been not talking for 6 weeks and have been continuing the conversation in their heads the entire time and have accumulated more than the available time can fully accommodate. He said, at the end of the 40 minutes, "Can we meet somewhere?" I said, "I need to think about what that means." He said, "I know. Think carefully." He said, "I am not asking you to decide anything except whether you want to continue the conversation in person. Everything else can wait for after that decision." I said, "I will call you on Thursday." He said, "I will answer." We met 9 times over the following 3 months. A park in Newark, Ohio, that was far enough from the settlement that the risk of community observation was manageable. A coffee shop in Granville where I had the specific experience of sitting across a table from someone in a public English space and being looked at by the other customers with the specific curious attention that an Amish woman in an English coffee shop produces, and having Andrew notice the looking and say, "Does that bother you?" And I said, "Less than the looking inside the settlement does." He said, "Why less?" I said, "Because they are looking at something they don't recognize. The settlement looks at something they think they know and are managing. The managing is more tiring than the looking." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I had not thought about the difference." He said, "I am thinking about it now." He said, "I think about a lot of things differently since the fence line." The community discovered us in the 3rd month, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the specific, inevitable mathematics of a closed community whose members move through a county that is not as large as the privacy it requires, through the specific bad fortune of a Tuesday afternoon when a family from the settlement was at the park in Newark for reasons entirely unrelated to me, and saw what they saw and reported what they saw with the specific, efficient certainty of people who understand that what they have seen is significant, and that significance requires reporting. Bishop Jacob Mast called my father the following day. My father called me to the kitchen that evening and placed the fact of what had been reported between us on the table, the same way my mother had placed the letters between us in other stories of other women in other kitchens in other communities. The specific flat, undeniable placement of a thing that is now public and requires response. I did not deny it. I had been raised to understand that honesty was not negotiable, regardless of its cost, and I was not going to pay the cost of dishonesty on top of the cost that honesty was going to require. I said, "Yes." My father was quiet for a long time with the quality of quiet that contains a great deal more than quiet. He said, "How long?" I said, 3 months of meetings. Before that, conversations at the fence line during the watershed assessment. He said, "Does he want to marry you?" The question surprised me in the specific way of questions that reveal the frame through which the asker is seeing the situation. I said, "We have not discussed that." My father said, "Then what is this?" I said, "This is knowing someone honestly." My father looked at me across the table with the expression of a man who loves his daughter and is in the process of discovering that the loving and the understanding have arrived at a junction where he cannot hold both without losing one. He said, "The bishop will need to be informed." I said, "I know." He said, "There will be consequences." I said, "I know that too." The consequences were delivered in the formal room with the formal arrangement of elders that our community's proceedings required. Bishop Jacob Mast did not read from letters this time. He did not have letters. He had the testimony of 2 community members who had seen me in Newark with an English man, testimony that was accurate and that I confirmed when asked because honesty was not negotiable. He said the community would require a period of formal accountability. He said my association with the Englishman was to cease immediately. He said my movements outside the settlement would be restricted for a period of no less than 4 months. He said my father's standing in the community would be affected by my choices, and that I should understand this and allow it to inform my decision about how to proceed. He said the last thing directly and without apology, as a fact he considered relevant for me to hold, and it was the last thing that made the decision I had been approaching finally arrive completely. He was using my father's standing as a weight on the scale of my decision. He was correct that it was a weight. He was incorrect that a weight and an argument are the same thing, that the existence of a cost is equivalent to the existence of a reason. I sat in the formal room and I felt the weight he was applying, and I held it honestly, and I found that it was significant, and that the significance did not change what I understood about what I needed. It only changed what the need was going to cost. The cost was everything he had promised. My father's standing was affected in the specific painful ways that a community applies consequence to the family of someone who has disrupted its expectations. My mother's social life contracted in the specific social cooling that our community applied to the families of its departing members. My younger sisters navigated the specific difficult social position of siblings who are not responsible for what has happened, but who are also not entirely outside it. These costs were real. I had known they were real before I paid them. Knowing the cost before paying it does not make the paying less painful. It makes you the kind of person who pays anyway, which is different from being the kind of person who did not know, and the difference matters. I left the community 14 days after the formal proceeding. Not because I had been pushed out, but because the proceeding had completed the measurement of the gap between what I needed and what the community could offer, and the measurement had produced a number I could not argue with. I contacted Andrew from the farm supply store phone and I said, "I am leaving." He said, "When?" I said, "Friday." He said, "I will help you find the beginning." He did not say he would be there waiting. He did not make it romantic. He made it practical, the specific, respectful practicality of someone who understands that what the person in front of them is doing is their own and requires their support rather than their management. Andrew and I are together. I want to say that plainly because the story's shape has suggested it and the truth confirms the shape. We are together in the specific, honest, careful way of 2 people who found each other across a significant distance and who understand that the distance does not disappear simply because it has been crossed, that it requires ongoing acknowledgement and ongoing navigation, and the daily willingness to choose each other with full knowledge of what the choosing cost and what it gives. He chose me across a fence line with equipment and a notebook and the specific quality of attention that sees rather than looks. I chose him across everything my community had given me and asked me to protect. We are choosing each other still, my mother writes. Her letters arrive without a return address and contain the specific, careful love of a woman communicating across a distance she did not choose and is navigating with the specific grace of someone who loves more than the structure allows for and is finding, in the finding, the outer limits of what the structure can contain. I write back with the fullness of someone who has found the life that is her actual size. I tell her about Andrew. I tell her about Columbus. I tell her about what it feels like to walk into a room and not have the room rearrange itself around my face because the room does not know me well enough to have decided what my face means. I tell her it is quieter. I tell her the quiet is good. My father has not written. I wait for him the way you wait for something that you cannot control the timing of but that you believe is coming, with the specific patient hope of someone who has paid the cost of honesty and who trusts that honesty, given sufficient time, eventually reaches even the people it was most expensive to reach. I am still waiting. I am doing other things while I wait. I am building a life that is entirely mine, in a city with a creek running through it that Andrew has assessed and found healthy, which seems appropriate, which seems like the specific grace that arrives when the story you are living has been honest enough to deserve it. In the book of Ruth, chapter 2, verse 12, Boaz says, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." I came to take refuge in a life outside the settlement's wings, and I found, in that refuge, Not the absence of the settlement, but the presence of myself. The full, unmanaged, specific version of a woman who was the most beautiful in her community, and who needed, more than the beauty needed managing, someone to look at what was behind it. Andrew looked. He is still looking. I am still there to be found. My name is Miriam. I was the most beautiful Amish woman in Ohio, and my love for an outsider cost me everything my community had given me. And everything is not a small word, and I am not using it carelessly. It cost everything. And on the other side of everything was a life that cost everything because it was worth everything. I am living inside the worth now, every day, in good light, with a man who sees rather than looks, and a creek he has assessed and found healthy, and a window that faces the water, and a life that is entirely the right size for the person living it. And that, every word of it, is true.